thing I had ever done. Now, I'm going to set the mood here, set the stage a little bit. I was about 19 years old, and I do I have to point a certain area? There we go. So there's me in 19. I'm just kind of setting the stage, painting the picture a little bit. I don't share this often. This is kind of a treat. Now, I was probably a little bit younger than that. It's fine. But so my hair got a little bit bigger, a little bit longer, a little wilder, if you can imagine that. It is difficult, and I try to forget. But I'm 19 years old, and I just started going back to church. And our pastor had mentioned something, and I felt like I should do it. And so I was going to go do the scariest thing I had ever done. I was going to go and do something called soul winning. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, basically we were going out as a church and we were going to visit people, go to their homes and tell them about our church and invite them to come. But after that, and really more important than that, we were going to tell them about Jesus and how they could be saved. Now, as soon as the pastor said that, I knew that's something I wanted to do, something I needed to do, but I was scared to death. This was honestly, up until that point in my life, probably the scariest thing I had ever done. I'm talking, I was shy, backward, insecure, not how I didn't like to stand up in front of people. I would avoid it at all costs. I remember kind of calculating out my percentages, like could I still graduate if I didn't do this in front of people presentation, like that kind of nervous, like so insecure that if a girl told me she liked me, I thought she must be lying because no one could ever like me. So I'm this shy, nervous, insecure kid with this wild hair. But I just felt like I should go soul winning. Like I just felt like I ought to tell somebody about Jesus. That seemed like a thing to do. So I go to the church, and the pastor at the church told me later, he's like, listen, when you came in with that hair, I knew you were going with your dad. I was not going to take you out. So my dad was there. I showed up like 5 minutes late, and he's like, you go with your dad. And so he sent me out, and we went out, and it was a most amazing thing I had ever seen. And I think, for this series, we're talking about evangelism and witnessing, and that just makes everyone very uncomfortable. I think of all the things, when we think about the things God has called us to do and all the things that we want to do, I think evangelism, witnessing, sharing our faith is probably the scariest. I'm probably not the only person that is nervous about telling others about Jesus. I'm probably not the only person that has been scared and afraid to witness. So I think we're probably all in the same boat, and this isn't a series where we're like bashing you over the head, like you have to do this a certain way in this certain time, and you have to do it just like me, and if you don't, then shame on you, and you don't care about people. That's not really my posture. And I think maybe it was years ago, and I think I've learned, I think what RBO says is very true. The devil scares more people than he dares people. Most Christians, and I would go so far as to maybe say every Christian, really wants to tell people. They really want to. They want to share their faith. They want other people to be saved. They want people to know the peace and the love and the joy that comes in only through Jesus. They want people to come to the church. They want to make a difference. They want to. They're just scared and they're nervous. And so really what we're talking about is how to overcome some of these barriers. How do we deal with fear? How do we deal with shame? How can we be bold and how can we be brave? How can we live our life that just naturally, the love of Christ pours through us, that the word of God flows from our lips just naturally and easily. And so that's why we call this Not Ashamed, because we really want to make evangelism for everyone. In different ways that different people can get their faith out and share the gospel and be a witness and be an example, be the salt and the light that I think truly all of us really want, but maybe didn't know how to, or maybe we're afraid to. So we're going to look at this passage. This is kind of a central passage for the next couple of weeks, but Romans chapter 1, if you would turn there. Romans chapter 1, verse 14 through 17. If you've got great eyesight, maybe you can read it from the PowerPoint, but not everyone maybe. So Romans chapter 1, verses 14 through 17. Romans 1, we'll start with verse 14. I am debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, but to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. For it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. And so Paul here makes this incredible statement, I am not ashamed. Now, that's a pretty amazing statement. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. So he's not ashamed of the gospel. And you might think for a minute, well, okay, you're Paul. I mean, and it was thousands of years ago, and you didn't have social media, and you didn't live in this culture. And if he was here in America, maybe things would be different. And he didn't have to put up with what I have to put up with at work, and he doesn't have to deal with the school that I have to deal with. Let's just put this in context. Like when Paul said to the Romans that he was not ashamed, that is a powerful and I think an encouraging statement. Paul was not ashamed of the gospel. And that's really something when you consider the Roman culture he's writing to. Think of who the leader was when Paul was writing Romans. Likely, that was the Emperor Nero. He's really become infamous in Christian culture for his brutal and vicious treating, vicious and just cruel treatment of Christians in that day, especially after the fire at Rome. He began to persecute Christians heavily. Not a good guy. This is from Tacitus. He quoted this about Nero. The Nero would cover with the skins of beasts Christians who were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to flames and burnt to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Very famously, he would light Christians and make them torches for garden parties and things like that. We're talking about an incredibly wicked and depraved human being that was viciously attacking the Christians, this odd religion of Christianity. And Paul is saying in this culture with this leader, I am not ashamed. I mean, I know our leadership in America leaves a lot to be desired, but it's not Nero. It's not Nero. So, I mean, this is the culture where Paul says, I am not ashamed. That was the leader. And think about the culture. I mean, so we think we have a difficult culture, and there are certainly many struggles and problems and issues and sin, and there's just a lot of evil in our world today. Is it less true of Paul's culture? The Romans at the time were sort of a leading civilization, an advanced society. There were a lot of different ideas and religions, but certainly a pagan-dominated culture. There was a god for every event, every act, every locality. Every location had its own god. Morality was low. Opinions were varied. It was a very busy, distracted society. People could really, if they wanted to become wealthy and have a comfortable life for that day and time. I mean, Rome had so many similarities to America, but it was really a culture that would accept any religion except for Christianity. When Christianity came along, it was so odd and strange and unique. And I really would like to spend some time to kind of really help us understand how different Christianity was from every other religion. And it's, for us in the Western world, it's hard for us to even to conceive how odd Christianity was. But Christianity was an offensive religion. Again, they were very open to just about any kind of ideology or thought, philosophy, or religion, but Christianity was an exception. One reason was the idol worship. When a Christian refused to bow to an idol, they not only offended that God, but they offended all the people that were represented by that God. It was an offensive religion for that reason. It was also a religion when they refused to bow to the emperor, when they refused to call the emperor God. That was an act of treason. They were seen as disloyal. Their failure to bow to idols and claim the emperor as God was not only odd and strange and unique, it was offensive to people. Now, it wasn't just idols, but when you think of the uniqueness of Christianity, they had a lot of rumors circling and swirling about the culture, about Christianity. Because of some misunderstandings of the Lord's Supper, they often accused Christians of cannibalism, eating the Lord's. They had this misunderstanding. They actually believed that Christians were cannibals. So if you were to say you were a Christian to the average Roman citizen in that day and that time when Paul said he's not ashamed, they may have likely instantly thought of you as a cannibal. Not only that, they thought the Christians were incest. Because Christians called each other brother and sister and they talked so much about love, they accused them of being incest. They actually accused Christianity of being atheists because they would not recognize the entire pantheon of gods, but only a single triune God. They were seen as atheists. So to say that you are a Christian, to claim the gospel of Christ, for Paul to say that he's not ashamed of the gospel, was again, said to a culture in which they may have accused him of being an atheist, a cannibal, or incest. That's kind of, again, I just want to paint a picture a little bit of what Paul was saying and how amazingly bold and how wonderful this proclamation is, because it was a terrible, wicked culture. And then also just the low standing of Christians. Christianity was despised by many because anyone could become a Christian. The fact that anyone could become a follower of Jesus meant that oftentimes slaves or runaways, criminals, children, women, they could all become Christians. And so the Christian church was made up of a lot of people that were despised by others in society. Many religions, you had to have a certain social status, a certain level of intellectual understanding, a certain amount of money. But the fact that anyone could become a Christian led many Christians to be despised by other people. So when Paul says, I am not ashamed, he's speaking to a culture, and he's claiming a religion that is offensive, that is misunderstood and slandered, and he's speaking this to people that would have despised him for his stance on Christianity and on Jesus Christ. And yet, despite all that, he says, I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I don't know what you're going to think of me, I don't know what you're going to say about me, but I'm not ashamed. So we think of the leader that he had to contend with, and we think of the culture in which he said this incredibly powerful and important statement. Also think about the consequences. I mean, there were real life consequences. We know because of Paul's faith, he spent much of his ministry in prison. Legend says he was beheaded in Rome for his faith. When Paul was saying, I am not ashamed, he was not being foolish. It wasn't that he was unaware of the consequences. He just didn't care. So again, for Paul to say, I am not ashamed of the gospel to the Roman people is quite the statement. And I think, well, how could Paul be so bold? How could Paul be so brave? I could never be like that. And I want to challenge us on that. How can we be bold as Paul was bold? How can we overcome shame as Paul did? I want us to think about, let's dig a little bit deeper. I think most of us would say we struggle to witness or we struggle to share our faith because we're afraid. What are we really afraid of? Most of us are not afraid. Paul had some legitimate fears about maybe being imprisoned or even put to death, but for us, it's social, right? We're afraid someone might not like us. They might disagree with us. Maybe they will change their opinion of us. Maybe they won't want to spend time with us. Maybe they won't be our friend anymore. It's really social consequences that we fear. It's honestly, to get its root, I would say it's really shame. And I don't mean this to be I'm not chastising us, but I think we all struggle with shame. We're afraid of what someone might say or what someone might think. And I'll tell you, shame is the only weapon that Satan has, but it is a powerful one. And Satan uses shame to keep us from being bold, to keep us from being confident, to keep us from spreading the gospel. And why wouldn't Satan go all out and attack to stop us from evangelizing? I mean, if there was one thing Satan could stop you from doing, don't you think this would be the thing? What could be of more importance, or what could be of greater consequence? So if there's anything Satan is going to try to stop you from, it's evangelizing, it's from witnessing, it's from sharing your faith. And the only tool Satan has, he can't physically stop you, he can't restrain God's word, he can't keep people from getting saved, he can't hinder the power of Jesus. The only thing he really can do is try to shame us out of giving our faith to others. And again, I don't say that lightly. Shame is the only weapon Satan has, but it is a powerful one. It's one we must contend with. And I think what we really need to do is kind of shift our minds in how we think. And if we can change the way we think, I think that will help us overcome this shame. I'm not speaking from a place of like, I've got this figured out and I'm never afraid and I'm never ashamed. I'm the outreach director, and it's a struggle for me. There have been times when I could have witnessed and I didn't. I should have said something and I didn't. So I'm saying this to us. I'm saying that I need to get better at this. I'm saying shame has stopped me far too many times. So by God's grace, let's look at some ways we can shift our thinking and overcome this shame that Satan is trying to hinder us with. By the way, it is just really interesting to say, it's kind of an aside, but it's amazing how our culture has shifted from, I guess a meritorious kind of society to an honor and shame society. And the honor and shame society is just exactly what the Roman people had, when Paul was speaking to them. It was an honor and shame society, and that's really what the cancel culture is all about, right? Follow the current of society or you'll be shunned, you'll be shamed, you'll be cast aside. It's just interesting how our society is shifting to that kind of honor, shame society. But anyway, how can we overcome this powerful weapon of shame? So the first point here is think more about what Christ has done than what others will think of you. Think more about what Christ has done than what others will think of you. Verse 14, Paul says, I'm a debtor. Now, had Paul racked up some gambling debts? Did he owe them money? Had he made a loan? Of course not. And if you begin to look at it, it wasn't really the people that Paul owed. It was the Lord. Verse 1 says he was a servant of Jesus Christ. He was a debtor to God. His obligation was to serve the Lord and to do his work and to do his will. So his obligation was not to the people as much as it was to the Lord. And I think 2 Corinthians explains why. 2 Corinthians 5:14-15, for the love of Christ constraineth us, because we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead, and that he died for all, that they which live should not henceforth live unto themselves, but in him which died for them and rose again. And in essence, I think Paul's stance would be, when I think about where I was, and I think about what I deserved, and I think about how God loved me and how God saved me, and despite all my faults and despite all my failures and all my mistakes, that Jesus died for me, and Jesus saved me from the hell I deserved. I'm obligated, I'm compelled, I'm constrained, I'm forced to live my life for him. And even if that means giving the gospel to a culture that can be offended, and even if that means giving the gospel to a culture that won't appreciate it, or it might even cost me something socially, maybe even physically, or might even cost me my life, I'm willing to do that. I have to do that. I'm obligated to do it because of what Jesus has done for me. And if we can spend some time thinking about, dwelling on, meditating on what Jesus has done for us, I think it becomes much easier to overcome shame to tell others. The more we think about what Christ has done, the less we think about the opinions of others. And so if we force ourselves and remind ourselves, and daily, I would say, praise and worship all that God has done for us, I think it helps us overcome some of that shame. I think a heart of gratitude just naturally and almost automatically begins to overflow into a sharing of the gospel and being a witness and a testimony to those around us. So getting our mind off of ourselves and onto the Lord. Again, not about us. And if we can keep our hearts and minds directed to God, it becomes much easier to stop being concerned about what people will think. Stop being concerned about what someone might say. And try to think about where I was at and where I deserved to go. And what Jesus did for me, I forget about that. I lose track of that. I get busy, and sometimes it slips my mind. But if I could just really dwell on what God has done for me, boy, I feel some obligation to tell someone else. Now, if I could get my mind off of what someone might say or how they will react or what they'll think about me, and if I could just think about what Jesus has done for me, it makes it easier for me personally to tell someone else. So get our minds and our hearts off of ourselves and onto Jesus, and a heart of gratitude, think and consider what he's done for us. I think the more we think about what Christ has done, the less we'll think about others and their opinions of us. I remember when I was a kid, going to McDonald's was like a big deal. I know it's not a big deal now, but it was such a big deal for me. I remember one time we went to McDonald's, and this is pretty rare, but we went to McDonald's, and I remember my mom put some money in the Ronald McDonald House tray there. We used to have a little place where you put change for the Ronald McDonald House. And I asked my mom, I thought it was strange, why did you do that? And she kind of told me the story I'd probably known and had forgotten, but I was 2 years old. I had a tumor on my spine, and we lived in Cody, Wyoming at the time. I had to go to Denver Children's, which is about 8 hours away. My parents were very young, had no resources, and when I was in the hospital, my parents could stay at the Ronald McDonald House right next to the hospital for free. And all of these years, it was probably 12 years later when she was telling me the story, she had never gotten over that. She'd never forgotten that kindness. And she still thinks about it, still talks about it. And I've never forgotten that either. It's 2, I didn't understand what was happening at the time. I'll just always be grateful for that kindness shown to my parents. And I think if we could be gracious and consider really what Jesus has done for us, I think if we get our heart and mind on him, and I think if we can dwell on all the good things he's given to us, I think it makes it easy for us to stop thinking about the opinions of others and stop being so concerned about what someone might say or what someone might think. So think more about what Christ has done for you than what others will think of you. Next, think more about what will happen to people than how they'll respond to you. I don't know if you noticed the theme. The first part was really getting our mind off of ourselves and off of other people and really pushing it back up to God. And verse 15, Paul talks about, so as much as in me, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. You know, Paul wasn't just doing this out of duty or obligation. No one was forcing him. He wasn't doing it for pay or for glory. He was eager. He was excited. He couldn't wait to give the gospel to them at Rome. I think, well, why would that be? Was it that he was going to be a hero? Was he getting him some new self-help philosophy that was going to be, prophetess to him for some reason? I don't think any of that's true. I think Paul was excited to give the gospel to the Romans because the Romans needed it. I don't think he was concerned about what they would say about him or what they would think about him or if he would get any credit or if he would become, a big deal in the Roman culture. I think he just was concerned about the Romans. And I find that if we can get our minds off of ourselves and onto other people, that always helps. Stop thinking about ourselves and start thinking about others. So instead of thinking about what they'll say about me, I need to start thinking about what will happen to them if they don't get the gospel. Philippians 2:4 says, look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. And, really to have the mind of Christ and to have the mind of Paul and to be bold and unashamed, we need to begin to think of other people. And I have found this to be true, that the more I think of other people, the less I think about myself. One of the public speaking tips I've got over the years is that if you can just focus yourself on the needs of the audience, you stop thinking about you. You get less nervous because it's not about me and what will you think of me, but if you can begin to think of the people you're speaking to and what they need and how you can help them, all of a sudden the tension is off of yourself and you get less nervous. I remember my friend, he had just went to boot camp. God was working in my life and I just had to tell him. I hadn't seen him. He went to boot camp. I just kept thinking about him, I just couldn't get him off my mind, and I just thought, he needs to know about Jesus. He needs to be saved. And I couldn't go and see him. You couldn't call him, but I could write him. And I wrote a letter and told him what God had done for me and how God was changing my life and how much I wanted him to be saved. And I put it in a letter, and then I was scared to send it. I was actually nervous. I remember thinking, oh my God, what if I send this and he doesn't like me anymore? If he doesn't want to be my friend? What if he doesn't talk to me? And I was so nervous to send that letter. You know what helped me? I just kept thinking, man, but what if he got saved? Like, how amazing would it be? How great. My best friend, if he became a Christian too, man, that'd be awesome. And I thought, what if he doesn't get saved? What if he never knows the Lord? And all of a sudden, I was able to send the letter, not because I got bold or brave, but I just started thinking about my friend. I was concerned about him. When I got my mind off me and I started thinking about him and what he needed, it became a lot easier. And so we can shift the mind off of ourselves and what people might say about us, what some people might think of us, and we can just give it to the people and think about what they need and what will happen to them. It helps. Sometimes we'll play a game. I got to psych myself up for this sometimes. And I think, worst case scenario, if I give someone the gospel, what's the worst thing that could happen? And, door-to-door soul, anything. Okay, well, they'll slam the door in my face. By the way, this probably happened, I've knocked literally thousands of doors. Maybe this happened twice, maybe. Maybe it's my good looks. I'm not sure, but, maybe they feel bad for me. Maybe they pity me. Maybe that's what it is. I don't know. But it's pretty rare. But it could happen. It could happen anytime. Maybe someone would be mean. Maybe they wouldn't like me. Maybe they think I'm a greedy preacher out for money or something like that. I don't know. They could think something bad of that, like that about me. They could. That's the worst case if I tell them. What's the worst case if I don't? I don't know about you, I need some extra motivation, and when I can remind myself, it's not about me, think about them, not about how I'm going to be perceived, but if I can think about what might happen to them, that helps. Helps me to be less ashamed. And in some ways, if I can really get my mind off myself, I find that I'm a little bit like Paul. I get eager, I get excited to do it. To actually tell people about Jesus actually becomes exciting because I think about what it could do for them, how it could change their life. Like, man, they could be free. They could, become a great Christian. They could do something amazing for the Lord. I begin to think about that. That helps me. So when we get our mind off of ourselves, start thinking of others, it helps. And I'll just say this, that only the truly selfless person is ever free from fear and shame. only a truly selfless person is free of fear and shame. When we are afraid or we're ashamed, it's because we're hanging on to self. It's about us to some degree. Because if it's not about us and we are completely selfless, we're living completely for others and completely for the Lord, there's no more fear. There's no more shame. Fear and shame can only control those people that have some bit of self left. And so when we shift our focus, less about what people think of us, what someone might say about us, and onto them and what will happen to them, I think it becomes much easier to be bold like Paul. Lastly, think more about the eternal than the temporary. Again, Paul was not excited to give them a new self-help technique. He didn't have a book to promote. He wasn't there to give them some sales pitch and increase profit margin. He wasn't excited about that. He was excited to give them the gospel. Why? Because it's the power of God unto salvation, an eternal salvation. He was excited because he had a truth that would literally change their life in all their eternity. That's why he was motivated. That's why he was excited, because he had something eternal. And I think these just great verses. I think every Christian will have them memorized. But 2 Corinthians 4, 17, 18, for our light affliction. It doesn't feel light. It doesn't always feel light, but our affliction is light compared to the great glory that awaits us. So for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, doesn't feel like that. That's why we have to memorize these verses and dwell on God's word, because it doesn't feel light. It doesn't seem for a moment. It seems heavy and it seems long and it seems difficult. But for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding eternal weight of glory. That's kind of like this really amazing phraseology, like exceedingly, like above and beyond. Like our affliction is so light compared to the great riches that await us. And not only are these riches great and wonderful and amazing beyond what we can conceive, but they're eternal. Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for something far more exceeding an eternal weight of glory. And again, that's, I guess, beyond our comprehension, but it's worth meditating and dwelling on those words. Our light affliction. And witnessing is a light affliction sometimes. Sometimes someone won't like you. Someone will refuse. Someone might think differently of you. That's true. And I'm not dismissing that or discounting that. That hurts. But compared to the exceeding weight of the eternal glory, it's light. And it is momentarily. It doesn't last forever. That won't haunt us in heaven. It is momentary. And so when we can remind ourselves that whatever light affliction we may face is nothing compared to the riches that await us, it helps us to be bold. When we remember that this light affliction will end and that the glory that shall be revealed is eternal, I think it helps. So it's getting our mind off what happens here and now and thinking about the future and thinking about eternity. So our light affliction, for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And thinking about the eternal consequences and not about the immediate have always helped me become more bold. Now, there was a story I heard, and I actually read this. It was a true story in Voice of the Martyrs several years ago, but it stuck with me, and I can't shake it. It was a 14-year-old girl, maybe she was 15, and she was in a Muslim country. It was a restricted country. Somehow she stumbled upon a Bible. She read the Bible, got saved, became a believer. Now, she was secretly reading the Bible until one day her parents found out. Parents found out she had the Bible. They asked her if she believed it. She said yes, and they began to mock her. They began to ridicule her. And that wasn't enough. That wasn't stopping her. So then her father began to beat her. And I'm talking about serious beatings. I'm talking about multiple broken bones, trips to the hospital, serious beatings. And sometimes when her father was beating this teenage girl, her mother would yell, "Beat her harder, beat her harder." So she's rejected by her family. No one in her culture can understand what she's going through. I mean, talking about an incredible hardship for a teenager to deal with. She was 17 at the time of the writing, I believe, and they said, "Why do you stay? Why don't you just leave? You could just go." But she said, if I leave, who will give them the gospel? How will they know I'm the only chance they have? So she counted the beatings, the mockings, the shame. She counted all that a light affliction. And she had on her mind something eternal. And she was so concerned about her parents' salvation, she was willing to endure. Now, I doubt that most of us will bear an affliction like that, but even that, compared to eternity, is light and momentary. So if we're going to be bold like Paul, and Paul was bold in a difficult and dangerous time, he was not ashamed of the gospel. If we want to be like Paul, I think it would help us to shift our mind and to shift our focus. Think more about what Jesus has done for us than what others might think of us. Think more about what will happen to people than what will happen to us. And think more about the eternal than the temporary. Now, again, I want to focus on evangelism for everyone. And we have a series of challenges. We have these papers. And again, if you didn't get one, we can get you one after. And I want to challenge you this week. I just want to challenge us all. This is for me. And it's sort of funny that Miss Jessie is here because she always had an unsaved prayer list. And, I took it and I had it and I pray occasionally, but I'll be honest, I don't pray regularly. I don't pray enough for people to be saved. And so my challenge to you this week, if you don't have an unsaved prayer list, you don't have a list of people that you pray for regularly, preferably daily, that need to be saved, start one. If there's a neighbor, a friend, a family member, someone you work with, a neighbor, and they're not saved, they're not a Christian, or you don't know, put them on a list and pray for them regularly. Again, I think daily would be ideal. If you have a prayer list, maybe it's just being more faithful. You've been praying for your neighbor, praying for your aunt, praying for your cousin, but, let's be honest, I have unsaved family members. I have people I know that aren't saved. And I'll be honest, I sometimes forget. And so this is for me too. Something I need to do. And, an unsaved prayer list, just praying for people to be saved. God's got to save them. No matter how bold we are, we're never going to save anyone. But it begins with prayer. And so think of someone in your life. Maybe you have one. Maybe you've got to start one. Maybe you need to restart one or be more faithful to an unsaved prayer list. I would encourage you to do that. Maybe you already have one, and maybe you pray regularly and faithful. That's amazing. Is there one more person you could add to that list? So my challenge to you this week is to begin praying for someone you know that is without Christ. Someone who doesn't know the Lord, maybe someone who has drifted. But let's begin praying for those around us that need the Lord. Father, we thank you and praise you. God, you've been so good to me and so kind and generous and faithful. And I'm so thankful you saved someone like me and you'll use someone like me. God, help me with shame. I struggle with fear and shame, and I shouldn't. I have the same spirit that Paul had. I could have the same boldness. Lord, I pray that you would help me to be bolder, to be more brave, to be less selfish, and not thinking about me, but thinking about those around me and thinking of my Lord who died for me. And I pray that you'd help us, Lord, to be good witnesses, to be good examples. Help us in Jesus' name. Amen.